walk all around on another man's ground, and take a fat sheep for me own. With the aid of me knife, I'll end of its life, and then I will carry it home, me brave boys. And then I will carry it home.
With the surrender of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, the war of conquest by vast armies in the north was over, and the war of raids had begun. The northern frontier was about to become one of the most dangerous places on the continent. People who would put their lives on the line for their political beliefs would increasingly put their families and their homes on the line as well. And in many towns, no one would be spared. As the war dragged on and the new Republic of Vermont struggled to find its footing, the old political rifts east and west of the Green Mountains reopened and threatened Vermont's very existence. Native peoples of the northern woodlands became decisive participants in the struggle. Loyalists gained new power in a war of wholesale devastation, and politics came to rival force of arms in victory, in defeat, and in survival itself. Following the surrender at Saratoga, what was left of the British Army abandoned Ticonderoga and retreated northward, leaving a vast no-man's land between British forces at St. John's, Canada, and American forces at Pittsford, Vermont. Though Vermont's governing council cautioned against it, groups of settlers returned to their homes in the Champlain Valley. In January 1778, the mostly empty community of Shelburne was an outpost on the shore of Lake Champlain. Captain Thomas Sawyer and 14 militia were sent north to fortify the house of Moses Pearson and transformed the place into a blockhouse. In March, several known loyalists abruptly left the settlement. The rest braced for an attack. 57 native warriors were guided down the lake by a Tory named Philo. Their first fire killed 2 inside Pearson's blockhouse, and then a sustained fight ensued. The attackers set the house on fire, and Lieutenant Barnabas Barnum of Moncton was killed while putting it out. The natives then set the roof alight, and Captain Sawyer offered his gold watch to anyone who would extinguish the flames. Joseph Williams climbed onto the roof with a barrel of Mrs. Pearson's beer from the cellar, which he used to douse the burning shingles. The skirmish continued for 2 hours, and the raiding party withdrew. The militia cautiously emerged and found the bodies of a British officer and a native warrior in a nearby field. They believed other bodies had been dropped through a hole cut in the ice. It was an indication of what was to come, and the Vermont Council of Safety ordered settlers in the Champlain Valley to move south of Pittsford or be considered enemies. Some disregarded the order. Many others moved to southern Vermont, but returned in the summer and fall to plant and harvest crops. In May, despite efforts by New York to prevent it, Ethan Allen was released through a prisoner exchange, and he returned to Vermont. Led by the Allens and by the newly elected Governor Thomas Chittenden, the Bennington Party tightened its grip on Vermont politics. But the Republic was struggling. New York refused to acknowledge Vermont independence, blocked all possibility of recognition by Congress, and continued its exertions to establish dominion over the Green Mountains. The New York governor at last decreed that if Vermont accepted New York authority, New Hampshire grants would be honored if the owner paid substantial costs and fees. The Bennington Party rejected this outright, but the response of the Connecticut River towns was mixed, and the old divisions began to reopen. Vermont had no mechanism for taxation, and the treasury was empty. Out of necessity, prominent citizens used their own money to pay for public projects. Jacob Bailey mortgaged more and more of his land to pay troops patrolling the frontier. Many others would become destitute in the service of the cause. The Assembly passed a law allowing the state to confiscate the land and property of Loyalists. The land would be sold off, and the proceeds used to fund the government. Ethan Allen was appointed to the Confiscation Committee. Increasingly, political rivals of the Bennington Party were labeled Loyalists. When some of the confiscated property wound up in the hands of the Allens and their adherents at bargain rates, the Valley Party began to look for ways to change the balance of power. 16 New Hampshire towns, disaffected by their lack of influence in a state where power was concentrated in the population centers, and eager to be free of the taxes levied on them, approached Vermont with a petition asking to join the Republic. General Jacob Bailey and Colonel Timothy Bettle worked together to sell the idea to the Assembly, and after some deliberation, the towns were admitted. This Eastern Union was popular among the Valley Party. The Connecticut River would no longer be a boundary, and since each town in Vermont had equal representation, the Connecticut River towns now outnumbered the Bennington Party in the Assembly. New Hampshire was furious, and the Bennington Party immediately set to work looking for ways to undermine the Union. But the need to prosecute the war continued. Throughout the summer of 1778, scouts of both sides plied Lake Champlain and the Green Mountains. The British scouts brought back information about an American buildup of supplies for another invasion of Canada planned for the following year. The British determined to destroy these supplies and forestall the invasion. The royal government appointed General Frederick Haldimand as the new governor of Canada. In August, he sent Lieutenant Colonel John Peters with the remnants of his regiment and a party of native warriors to raid the settlements on the Winooski River. The group set out, but after an accident with one of the boats, the natives wanted to abandon the mission. Lieutenant Richard Houghton used every exertion to shame them out of such dastardly conduct, and on my declaring by the advice of my officers that we should proceed if they left us, they agreed to go on if we would return to the Missisquoi Bay, and that I would procure them a supply of rum to be at that place on their return. When many of the natives turned back anyway, so did a number of Peter's loyalists. Only 34 men followed him to the Winooski River Valley, which they ascended some 30 miles, destroying a blockhouse and all of the houses and barns they encountered. Peters returned to report the success of the operation, but the affair cost him the confidence of General Haldimand, and he was increasingly sidelined in the British war effort. But Haldimand had more in store for Vermont that year.
I propose to send a respectable party, which will be covered by some ships and gunboats, and that it shall be as late as possible in going out, as the damage it may then do the enemy will be irreparable this season.
All of the crops were gathered in by the end of October, when British Major Christopher Carlton led the expedition to destroy the harvests and settlements of the Champlain Valley. He had a mixed force of 450 British, Hessian, and Loyalist troops, and 100 native warriors. They were accompanied down the lake by the ships Carlton, Maria, and a number of gunboats, all veterans of the Battle of Valker Island. The force moved cautiously to Crown Point, constantly on the alert for ambush or American spies. For several days, Major Carlton sent scouts out to collect intelligence. They collected many of the inhabitants they found and secured them aboard the Maria.
Monday, the 2nd of November, I sent fresh scouts to different parts of the country. At 12, one of them returned with Benjamin Everest. I desired him to be conducted to the main guard, and that no person should be allowed to come near or speak to him, but before I reached the guard, he made his escape. I made use of every means to catch him, but without success.
Afraid that word of his presence would get out and alarm the countryside, Carlton sent scouts in all directions. They found evidence of American scouting parties in the area, but after a few days, Carlton was satisfied that he would be able to safely conduct his mission. On November 6th, he struck. 300 men landed in Bridport, Vermont. 50 of them headed south to burn Moore's Mill, but ran into some Vermont militia, and after a brief skirmish, withdrew to the landing. The rest continued east, overland, until they reached Otter Creek. They burned the blockhouse and settlement at Middlebury, and then worked their way north, destroying a sawmill and all of the houses and barns they encountered in Weybridge, New Haven, and Vergennes. The fleet worked its way up the Vermont shore, destroying lakefront dwellings in Bridport, Addison, Panton, and Ferrisburgh. The forces reunited on Otter Creek. Before departing for Canada, a contingent was sent to the rebel stronghold at Moncton, where they burned 10 buildings and captured a large quantity of arms and ammunition. As the British moved with their captives, young Robert Sanford, barefoot and 10 years old, collapsed and was left behind. He retraced his steps and found his mother and some others hiding in a root cellar. They remained for 10 days, subsisting on potatoes, while young Robert walked south for many miles until he encountered some rebel militia and guided them to the group to effect their rescue. Carlton's raid was a resounding success. Over 100 buildings were destroyed, along with hundreds of livestock and large quantities of wheat, hay, and arms. The British took over 40 settlers back to Canada as captives. Their only casualties were 2 Hessians who deserted and 1 British soldier, killed by a falling tree. Most of the towns destroyed remained desolate for years to come. As the snow covered the Green Mountains, the Bennington Party regained the ascendancy. Ethan Allen made a backroom deal with the New Hampshire delegate to Congress that Vermont would be granted statehood in exchange for returning the towns of the Eastern Union. To drive the point home to the Vermont Assembly, Allen fabricated threats.
Except the state recede from such union immediately, the whole power of the United States of America will join to annihilate the state of Vermont.
Many in the Assembly suspected that it was an idle threat, but the Bennington Party was eager to end the Union regardless. Following impassioned debate, they pushed through a vote that excluded the towns of the Eastern Union from joining the existing Vermont counties, and also prohibited the formation of them into a new county. In disgust, Jacob Bailey resigned from his statewide offices. The lieutenant governor, 2 council members, and 24 legislators followed. In their absence, the Assembly voted to return the annexed towns to New Hampshire, and the Eastern Union was dissolved. The Continental Congress never lived up to their end of Allen's bargain for statehood, but the damage to Vermont politics was done. The Valley Party first asked New Hampshire to annex the whole republic. When this was refused, they explored the possibility of the Connecticut River towns defecting to New Hampshire, then began publishing pamphlets arguing for the formation of a new state between the Green and White Mountains. The Valley Party no longer considered itself part of Vermont, but the political divisions in the Green Mountains would get even worse in the years ahead. Despite widespread rumors of invasions of and from Canada, the campaign season of 1779 was relatively quiet. In May, an American patrol was ambushed and captured on Lake Champlain at Basin Harbor, following a harrowing race between American militia in bateaux and native warriors in canoes, while the parties fired muskets at each other on the water. Plans for a new invasion of Canada led to the extension of the road Jacob Bailey had begun in 1776. Colonel Moses Hazen extended what became known as the Bailey-Hazen Road until it was 60 miles in length, with a series of fortified blockhouses. On Lake George, a party of Warner's regiment was ambushed at 14 Mile Island. Several of the senior leaders were killed or captured. Major Gideon Brownson was wounded 12 times before he was taken prisoner, but survived his captivity and the war. There were several native raids on Pittsford, Vermont, and in November the town of Neshobe, later renamed Brandon, was burned. That summer, a man named Hamilton came to Newbury, Vermont, on parole from Burgoyne's surrendered army. He ingratiated himself with the locals and became a member of the community. He surreptitiously collected information about local leaders and about the region's geography and state of defense. He moved a few miles south to the town of Royalton, looked around there, and then went surveying lands in the woods with a group of known loyalists, and went over to the British in Canada. In August of 1780, he guided a party of British troops and native warriors up the Winooski River to strike at Barnard. They plundered a few cabins and departed with 4 captives. It was the first raid east of the Green Mountains, and it terrified people who had believed themselves relatively safe. Things were about to get far worse. In October 1780, Major Christopher Carlton led 1,000 men down Lake Champlain. They captured Fort Anne and its garrison of militia before proceeding to the southern end of Lake George, where the hungry and poorly supplied remnants of Warner's regiment manned the dilapidated and unfinished Fort George. Captain John Chipman commanded the post. When pickets noted indications of enemy forces in the woods, he sent out Captain Thomas Sill with a patrol of 48 men. They had no idea what they faced.
As it is reported to me that there is a small party of savages near Bloody Pond, you will immediately take 48 men and proceed on the road until you make discoveries of them. If you find a large party, you will immediately retreat to the fort, except they should be savages only, in which case you will attack immediately and charge upon them.
Captain Sill's command set out and ran first into Carlton's native warriors. They pressed the attack and soon found themselves outnumbered 5-1 and surrounded by 250 native warriors and loyalist rangers, with another 500 British regulars not far behind. Captain Sill's men refused to surrender and launched a charge to cut their way out. 13 of them actually managed to make good their escape. Almost all of the rest were killed, including Captain Sill. The British surrounded Fort George and took up a position on high ground overlooking the garrison. Vastly outmatched and with no supplies to withstand a siege, Captain Chipman surrendered. Warner's regiment had all but ceased to exist. Several days later, American scouts found the mutilated bodies of Captain Sill's men.
We found 22 slaughtered and mangled men. All had their skulls knocked in, their throats cut, and their scalps taken. Their clothes were mostly stripped off. Warner's officer recognized a lieutenant and others and cried like a child at beholding them. They laid upon their backs, scalped, and with their throats cut. One man only had not his throat cut. He was a mulatto and was lying on his face, the only one found in this posture. We supposed he had been the drummer, and his arms were tied behind him with the cord of his drum, and he had been killed by a spear in his back after he was tied. There were 6 or 8 spear wounds in the middle of his back, and the spear was left in his back. He was scalped. We supposed he had been more obstinate and valiant in withstanding the enemy, and they had therefore bound and tortured him alive. The fighting had been mostly with clubbed muskets, and the fragments of these, split and shivered, were lying around with the bodies. The barrel of one, I observed, had been bent full 6 inches from a straight line.
Ethan Allen raised a sizable militia force at Castleton, but they made no move to counter the British strike. Carlton's column raided settlements along the Hudson River, then returned to Ticonderoga with their prisoners. In the fall of 1779, American troops were sent beyond the New York frontier and laid waste to the villages and winter stores of the Iroquois Confederacy. Thousands of natives starved to death over the winter months. Eager for retribution, so many Mohawk responded to the British call for warriors for the raid of 1780 that another expedition was formed in order to make use of them all. As the incursion to Fort George unfolded in New York, Lieutenant Richard Houghton led 300 native warriors on a raid up the Winooski River. guided by Hamilton, their target was Newbury. They encountered some Patriot scouts on the way, who convinced the raiders that they were Loyalists who were merely out hunting in the woods. They told Lieutenant Houghton that Newbury was strongly defended, and that the occupants knew they were coming. The lie worked. The warriors turned south down the first branch of the White River and fell upon Royalton, Tunbridge, and Sharon. They struck in the morning, rapidly working their way through the settlements and rushing from farm to farm. They looted and burned the houses, destroyed the livestock, and killed male settlers who resisted or ran.
They pursued Thomas Pember till they came so near as to throw a spear at him, which pierced his body and put an end to his existence. He ran some time, however, after he was wounded, till by loss of blood he fainted, fell, and was unable to proceed farther. While they were tearing his scalp from his head, how did his dying groans pierce the skies.
I saw others flying for safety, but turning I was surprised by the sight of 2 Indians very near me, the foremost one with tomahawk in hand. We were face to face, and suddenly they both stopped. He waved his hand, "Come, come." I took to my heels and ran for escape, followed the road on the river bank but a little, jumped into the bushes out of sight and made for fording the river. The tomahawk one caught me in the back of the collar and gave me a few blows with his instrument. The 2 Indians stripped me of my outside garments. They took me by each arm to return to their company.
In an act of incredible bravery, 27-year-old Hannah Hendy went into the midst of the native party with her 2-year-old daughter to try to get the warriors to return her son Michael. She found Lieutenant Houghton and forcefully argued her case until he obtained the boy from his captors. Despite natives repeatedly taking an interest in recapturing Michael, she remained and continued to express at length that all of the children taken should be released. By day's end, she was shepherding 10 youngsters through the woods to the south, away from their captors. The Vermont militia responded quickly and caught up with the raiding party that night in the woods near Randolph. After a confused fight in the darkness, including threats that all 26 of the captive settlers would be killed, the militia stopped to wait for daylight, and the native warriors slipped away with their prizes. Scouts fanned out in front of Carlton's column, making contact with local Loyalists who had been engaged in spying, recruiting for Loyalist regiments, and maintaining a network of safe houses. Vigilant neighbors noticed the activity and reported it to Patriot authorities. 3 of the scouts were arrested and tried by a New York court. 2 of the men were hanged, and the third, James Van Duzen, saved himself by giving the court the British plans and the names of every Loyalist he could think of. His confessions led to many arrests and to the near-total destruction of the British spy network in upstate New York. Most shocking, however, was his revelation that Ethan Allen and the leaders of the Bennington Party had negotiated a truce between Vermont and Great Britain. Most dismissed the assertion out of hand, but some were suspicious. For Jacob Bailey, the assertion fit all of his personal prejudices, and the inaction of the militia at Castleton during the raid to Fort George seemed to be proof enough of Allen's treachery. Bailey's suspicions were certainly overblown, but would not remain so for long. Justice Sherwood was an early settler of New Haven, Vermont. He had been one of the Green Mountain Boys and was with Ethan Allen at the capture of Ticonderoga in 1775, but remained loyal to the Crown. By the spring of 1776, he was arrested, flogged, and sent to prison for his Loyalist sympathies, but escaped and went north to the British. He accompanied Burgoyne's army the following year and escaped capture at the Battle of Bennington, only to be surrendered with the rest of the army after Saratoga. After being exchanged, he fled to Canada, and by 1780 had spent 2 years leading natives and Loyalists on scouts and raids along Otter Creek. As Carlton's force ravaged Upper New York, Sherwood arranged a meeting with Ethan Allen for a prisoner exchange. But General Haldimand had sent him with another secret mission, to present an offer for Vermont to rejoin the British Empire.
I had an interview with General Allen. I proceeded to tell him that General Haldimand was no stranger to their disputes with the other states and to all that had passed between Congress and Vermont, and that this was a proper time for them to cast off the Congress's yoke and resume their former allegiance to the king, by which they would secure to themselves those privileges they had so long contended for with New York. I made known to him the general's proposals, then expressed my own anxious desire that they would accept of them from my own tender sentiments of regard and friendship which I felt for the people of Vermont. General Allen observed that he should take them into very serious consideration, and that I might rest assured our present conference would remain a secret.
Though Allen initially refused, after talking it over with some of the Bennington Party leadership, he agreed to future meetings to discuss the subject. Prisoner exchanges would provide the cover for ongoing secret negotiations between the Bennington Party and General Haldimand. With the destruction of the British intelligence network in New York and the opening of negotiations with the leaders of the Bennington Party, the British Secret Service would create new contacts in Vermont. The war would devolve into ever smaller factions and individual actors, spying on each other, switching sides, and acting as double agents. It would descend into arrests, hangings, and kidnappings. It would become a war of espionage, and it would get personal.
Alas, my love, you have done me wrong, to cast me off discourteously, and I have loved you so long, delighting in your company. Green sleeves was all my joy, green sleeves was my delight, green sleeves was my heart of gold, and who